You could almost hear the world holding its breath in September 1939, as if everyone sensed that something enormous and violent was about to explode. Yet behind the loud speeches, the marching boots, and the thundering engines of German tanks, there was a quieter, almost invisible secret that would shape the destiny of the war. Germany was powerful, but dangerously dependent. It was a nation preparing for global domination while standing on an economic foundation that could crumble the moment its supply routes were cut. This contradiction would trigger one of the most decisive strategies of World War II, the Allied blockade of Germany. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he promised to rebuild Germany's shattered pride and restore its military glory. Huge factories roared back to life, runways stretched across the countryside, and armored divisions rolled out with dramatic speed. To the world, Germany appeared unstoppable. But British intelligence, observing from across the Channel, saw something different: a giant with iron fists but empty pockets. Germany possessed ambition, technology, and manpower, but it lacked one crucial ingredient: resources. Its land did not produce enough oil, rubber, metals, or even food to sustain a prolonged war. If cut off from global trade, Germany would eventually exhaust itself, no matter how fearsome its armies looked on paper. The British had learned a great deal from World War I. They knew that the sea was not merely a battlefield, it was a lifeline. Whoever controlled the oceans controlled the flow of goods, money, fuel, and food. And Britain still commanded one of the strongest navies on earth. So even before the first bullets were fired, British planners had imagined a strategy to slowly, silently suffocate Germany's war machine. Not through dramatic battles, but through a grip so tight that Germany would find itself gasping for fuel, materials, and food. The idea wasn't glamorous, but it was deadly. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war and instantly set their blockade plan in motion. The first British warships moved into position around the North Sea, the Atlantic approaches, and narrow channels where merchant ships were forced to pass. At first glance, it looked like a normal naval deployment. But every ship now had a new mission: identify and intercept anything that could help Germany survive. This included tankers carrying oil, freighters loaded with metals, grain shipments, and even chemical supplies. Anything that could indirectly support Germany's industry was now considered fair game. Still, the blockade was not simply about catching ships. It quickly grew into an enormous global intelligence operation. The British Ministry of Economic Warfare monitored trade deals, inspected cargo lists, interfered with bank transfers, and pressured neutral countries like Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, and Spain not to supply Germany. Ports across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia were quietly watched by British agents. Newspapers at the time spoke of German aggression in Europe, but rarely reported the silent chess game happening in world markets, where Britain used diplomatic and financial pressure to shrink Germany's access to global commerce. Germany was fully aware of the danger. To counter the blockade, the Nazis raced to secure resources through conquest. Hitler's rapid takeover of Austria and Czechoslovakia gave him factories and minerals. The invasion of Norway in 1940 was especially strategic. Germany needed Norwegian ports to safely receive Swedish iron ore shipments, which were essential for steel production. This wasn't just expansion, it was economic survival disguised as military ambition. At the same time, Germany struck a surprising deal with the Soviet Union through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. Under this agreement, the Soviets shipped oil, grain, metals, and rubber to Germany, materials that the blockade was designed to cut off. The pact shocked the world. Two ideological enemies joined hands, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. For Germany, it was a temporary lifeline. For the Soviet Union, it was a way to buy time. And for Britain, it meant the blockade would take longer to show its true power. Despite these German maneuvers, Britain remained confident. The Royal Navy continued tightening its grip. Merchant ships suspected of carrying German-bound goods were stopped, inspected, and sometimes seized. Many neutral countries protested, but Britain insisted the blockade was essential for global security. The situation became so complex that ships would reroute thousands of miles just to avoid British-controlled waters. Some tried traveling under false flags, others used forged documents. But British intelligence often uncovered the truth. Meanwhile, the United States, still officially neutral, quietly leaned toward Britain. President Franklin D. Roosevelt allowed American factories to supply the Allies through the Lend-Lease Act. American naval patrols began escorting British convoys in the Atlantic even before the U.S. formally entered the war. By late 1941, the Allied blockade was no longer a British operation. It had become an international effort with the combined strength of two of the world's most powerful navies. Germany responded aggressively with its U-boat fleet. Submarines were unleashed into the Atlantic in an attempt to sink Allied supply ships and disrupt the blockade. Early on, they had terrifying success. Entire convoys vanished beneath the waves. The British public, reading grim headlines, feared starvation and invasion. But the British remained committed to the blockade, believing that patience and persistence would eventually pay off. This early phase of the war was defined not just by tanks and planes, but by the quiet tension of supply and demand. The world's oceans had become a battlefield without gunfire, an arena where ships carrying food, oil, and metals were as valuable as armies. German industry, though powerful, began to feel the strain. Raw materials declined. Factories worked harder with less. Civilians faced shortages. Yet the true impact of the blockade was still years away. At this stage, it was a slow tightening of a noose. But Britain understood that time was on its side. The longer Germany fought, the faster it would burn through its limited reserves. The British leadership was confident, Germany's strength was spectacular but unsustainable. And the day would come when the blockade would become a decisive blow, invisible yet unstoppable. The world didn't know it yet, but the silent war on supplies had already begun shaping the outcome of World War II. The invisible wall tightens. By early 1940, long before the world fully understood it, the seas around Europe had transformed into something far more dangerous than any battlefield. Ships that once carried grain, fuel, or simple manufactured goods now moved through waters filled with suspicion, surveillance, and silent confrontation. The Allied blockade, which had begun as a set of naval orders, was quickly evolving into an intricate global machinery designed to choke the German war effort without ever firing a shot. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Yet every passing week made it more effective and more terrifying for Germany. Most people in Britain or America followed newspaper headlines filled with stories of German attacks, air raids, invasions, and political speeches. What they rarely saw were the quiet moments when British officers in darkened naval rooms studied radio transmissions or intercepted shipping reports, marking circles on maps that represented merchant vessels whose cargo could help Germany sustain its military. These were not battles anyone watched, but they shaped the war with the precision of a surgeon's hand. The blockade's mechanics were astonishingly complex. British naval ships patrolled the North Sea and the Atlantic like tireless guardians, stopping vessels that looked suspicious or that carried goods from countries known to trade with Germany. Crews boarded these ships, examined documents, questioned captains, and sometimes seized the cargo entirely. But this was only the most visible layer of the blockade. Behind it existed a vast web of intelligence networks, economic agencies, diplomats, spies, and analysts who tracked the movement of every major resource in the world. At the heart of this operation stood the Ministry of Economic Warfare in London. Its job sounded dull, almost bureaucratic, but its operations were anything but mundane. The ministry gathered economic data from across the globe: trade reports, port documents, shipping logs, financial transactions. They examined what countries like Sweden, Turkey, Spain, or Portugal were exporting and to whom. If a shipment of tungsten left Portugal, the ministry wanted to know exactly where it was headed. If Swedish iron ore suddenly increased in volume, alarm bells rang. Nothing, not even the smallest package traveling across borders, was considered unimportant. What made the blockade even more powerful was Britain's ability to manipulate neutral countries through diplomacy and economic leverage. Sweden, for instance, had long supplied Germany with iron ore, crucial for building tanks, aircraft, and weapons. The British could not simply force Sweden to stop. Sweden was neutral. But they could negotiate, pressure, and threaten to halt other exports to Sweden if it cooperated too closely with Germany. Sometimes these talks grew tense, but gradually, many neutral nations began tightening their own restrictions, whether out of fear, practicality, or the hope of avoiding conflict with the Allies. The United States also played a crucial role, even before it officially joined the war. American banks monitored German financial transfers. American intelligence tracked cargo leaving Latin American ports. And American factories produced weapons and supplies that strengthened Britain's ability to enforce the blockade. Though American newspapers still maintained the image of neutrality, within government circles the message was clear: German access to global resources had to be restricted, and the US would help make that happen. Meanwhile, Germany watched the tightening noose with increasing anxiety. Its leaders understood that the blockade posed just as serious a threat as any British bomber or Soviet tank. The Nazi government scrambled to find alternative sources of materials. They pushed synthetic fuel production to its limits. They stripped occupied countries of metals, grain, and equipment. They traded with the Soviet Union under their temporary pact, receiving oil, rubber, and other vital materials. But even these efforts could not fully counter the growing pressure. The seas were too vast, the Allied surveillance too thorough, and the world's financial networks too intertwined for Germany to completely escape. To break the blockade, Germany turned to a weapon that could slip beneath waves without warning: the U-boat. German submarines were sleek, stealthy, and deadly. Their mission, however, was not to support German imports. Instead, they sought to destroy Allied supply convoys. The hope was simple: if Britain suffered starvation, shortages, and economic collapse, it would loosen the blockade and negotiate peace. So began a brutal struggle beneath the Atlantic waves, one that the press later called the Battle of the Atlantic. In those early years, the U-boats achieved terrifying success. Convoys were sunk in the night, merchant sailors vanished without trace. For the British public, these were the darkest months of the war, when the threat of defeat seemed alarmingly real. Yet even at the height of the U-boat campaign, the blockade continued its steady tightening. Every ship Germany lost, every tanker sunk, made its ability to break the blockade weaker. The Germans could inflict damage, but not enough to reopen their severed trade routes. By 1941, the blockade had become an invisible wall stretching across oceans, ports, and continents. British aircraft flew long patrols over the sea, spotting suspicious vessels and directing naval forces toward them. New technologies such as radar and sonar made it easier to locate enemy submarines and enforce control over shipping lanes. The Allies developed faster, more maneuverable escort ships designed specifically to protect convoys and enforce the blockade. The result was a growing network of maritime control that Germany found harder and harder to penetrate. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 transformed the blockade from a British-led operation into a truly global system. American warships joined British fleets in the Atlantic. American industrial might produced ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. American aircraft began patrolling long stretches of ocean once beyond Britain's reach. With two naval superpowers working together, the blockade became nearly impossible to break. In Germany, frustration grew. Factories struggled to find raw materials. Cotton had to be replaced with synthetic textiles. Rubber shortages crippled the production of tires and vehicle parts. Chemical companies lacked ingredients for explosives. Even small industries, like paper production, began to suffer from resource scarcity. Every gap created by the blockade forced the Nazi leadership to find improvised solutions, and every improvised solution was slower, less efficient, and more expensive. The true power of the blockade was not dramatic destruction but slow, relentless pressure. It was like a cold wind that never stopped blowing, chilling Germany's industrial heart bit by bit. Most Germans did not fully understand it, they simply felt shortages, delays, and rising difficulty in daily life. Soldiers at the front sensed it through reduced equipment and weaker supply lines. Generals noticed it when fuel deliveries failed to arrive on time. Hitler noticed it when his planners agonized over dwindling reserves. And all the while, the blockade continued tightening, day after day, night after night. It was not the kind of war that produced heroic photos or stirring headlines, but it was a war that Germany could not escape, a silent force shaping the outcome of the conflict long before the world realized just how decisive it would become. A nation running out of breath. If you walked through the streets of Berlin in 1942, you might have noticed something strange. Shop windows still displayed goods, factories still roared, soldiers still marched, and the propaganda loudspeakers still promised victory. Yet below this facade, an invisible crisis was unfolding. Germany, despite its early triumphs on the battlefield, had begun to run out of the very materials it needed to stay alive. The Allied blockade, once dismissed by Nazi leaders as an inconvenience, was now quietly sinking its teeth into every corner of German society. And while explosions echoed on distant fronts, the real damage came from something no one could hear: the slow loss of fuel, food, metal, and hope. At first, the shortages were subtle enough that most civilians barely noticed. Bread became slightly smaller, meat rations grew thinner, and coal deliveries seemed irregular. But by the end of 1942, the strain was no longer a secret. Housewives stood in long, freezing lines waiting for food that often never arrived. Farmers struggled to meet impossible quotas. Factories operated on reduced hours because they lacked raw materials. Civilians whispered cautiously among themselves, afraid of the Gestapo, yet unable to ignore the obvious signs: the war was beginning to bleed Germany from the inside. Fuel was the most urgent crisis. Germany had always depended heavily on imported oil, and once the blockade cut off foreign supplies, the entire nation attempted to survive on synthetic fuel produced from coal. But the synthetic plants could not keep up. German tank divisions on the Eastern Front began rationing fuel to the point where commanders sometimes cancelled offensives simply because they did not have enough gasoline to move vehicles. Luftwaffe pilots, once trained rigorously, were now given only minimal flight hours. Many new pilots went into battle barely prepared, flying outdated or poorly maintained aircraft. The skies, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, began to favor the Allies not just because of superior numbers, but because Germany simply could not fuel its machines. Factories faced a devastating decline in raw materials. Steel production slumped as iron ore shipments grew scarce. Rubber, once imported from Asia, was impossible to replace. Tires wore out faster than they could be repaired. Copper shortages became so severe that electrical wiring in new military equipment was redesigned using inferior substitutes. Even gunpowder production suffered because chemicals like toluene and nitrates were limited. Engineers worked tirelessly to create substitutes, but improvisation could not match the precision and durability needed for modern warfare. Inside industrial cities, workers felt the pressure firsthand. Machines broke down more often. Spare parts were unavailable. Workdays became longer, yet production dropped. Doctors reported a rise in workplace injuries caused by malnutrition and exhaustion. German propaganda insisted that the shortages were temporary and blamed everything on sabotage, foreigners, or enemy conspiracies, but workers knew better. The blockade was choking the life out of their industries. Food shortages became a central crisis. The government rationed everything: bread, sugar, meat, eggs, butter, and even potatoes. Many families survived on watery soups and black market exchanges. Urban residents traveled to the countryside seeking farmers willing to spare a little food in exchange for valuables like jewelry, coats, or furniture. The state responded harshly, cracking down on illegal trade, but the desperation only grew. Children were often the first to feel the consequences. Health records from schools showed rising cases of anemia, underweight students, and weakened immune systems. Hospitals struggled to treat illnesses because medical supplies were increasingly scarce. Even basic medicines like aspirin and antibiotics were difficult to obtain. Germany's medical system, once among the most advanced in Europe, was stretched beyond limits. Transportation and logistics systems began collapsing as well. Germany's rail network was vital for supplying both civilian sectors and the military, but without adequate coal, trains frequently stalled or ran at reduced capacity. Freight schedules became unreliable. Entire shipments went missing or arrived weeks late. Some trains were forced to stop mid-journey and wait for additional fuel, causing chain reactions across the network. These failures trickled directly to the front line. Soldiers in the Soviet Union complained about receiving insufficient ammunition, uniforms, and winter clothing. Many froze or starved not because of enemy action, but because supplies failed to reach them in time. Letters from German soldiers carefully censored by authorities still hinted at the truth. Lines like "we manage with what is available" or "things are difficult but we endure" became common phrases masking deeper despair. As 1943 progressed, the blockade's effects deepened. It wasn't sudden, it was like watching a mighty machine grind to a slow, painful halt. Even high-ranking Nazi officials privately admitted that Germany was fighting two wars, one against the Allies on land and another against economic collapse. In Berlin, long meetings were held where planners debated how to stretch dwindling resources. They drew charts predicting fuel supplies, projected steel shortages, and calculated how many aircraft could realistically be produced. Each month, the numbers looked worse. Hitler, unwilling to accept these realities, demanded impossible production increases. Factories were ordered to work day and night, regardless of the shortages. When that failed, the regime turned to forced labor from occupied territories. Millions of people were brought into Germany under brutal conditions, but forced labor could not magically create resources that simply did not exist. With no fuel, no metal, and no spare parts, even a massive workforce could only achieve limited results. Morale on the home front crumbled. People tried to remain loyal, fearing punishment, but the weight of daily hardship pressed them down. Air raids devastated German cities, and without enough raw materials, rebuilding became almost impossible. Families slept in basements because their homes could not be repaired. Children collected wood debris for heating. Even soap became a luxury. In 1944, the situation worsened dramatically. The blockade had become so effective that many industries were surviving only on leftover stockpiles. Coal shortages led to widespread power cuts. Workers often labored in half-lit factories, machines running only intermittently. Rail lines froze in winter. Soldiers at the front begged for supplies that never arrived. Civilians whispered that the war was lost, though few dared to say it openly. By late 1944, Germany was a nation exhausted. It had conquered vast territories, fought brutal battles, and displayed enormous military strength, yet it could not overcome the fundamental truth: no army can fight without resources. The Allied blockade had succeeded in a way bombs and bullets never could. It had drained the life from Germany's war machine slowly, relentlessly, and with absolute certainty. And though the war would continue into 1945, the fatal damage had already been done. Germany was collapsing not simply because it was defeated in battle, but because it had been starved from within. Collapse in slow motion. By the beginning of 1945, Germany looked powerful only on paper. Its maps still stretched across Europe, its armies still occupied cities from Paris to Warsaw, and its propaganda still claimed that victory was just around the corner. But the truth was visible in every cracked road, every silent factory, every dimly lit home, and every exhausted soldier. The country was collapsing from the inside. The Allied blockade, once a distant threat whispered about only in government offices, had become an undeniable force pressing on every aspect of German life. It had taken years, moving slowly and relentlessly, but it had finally reached the point where Germany could no longer breathe. The most striking evidence of this collapse came from the skies. Allied bombers flew deeper and more frequently into German territory, meeting less resistance than ever before. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, struggled to send even a handful of operational aircraft into battle. Pilots wrote in their diaries about the frustration of sitting in cockpits without enough fuel to take off. Maintenance crews worked with whatever scraps they could find, often cannibalizing parts from wrecked planes. Airfields that once hosted dozens of fighters now housed only 2 or 3, and even those were grounded for lack of aviation fuel. What had once been a symbol of German strength was now a silent reminder of how thoroughly the blockade had drained the nation's lifeblood. On the ground, the situation was equally bleak. German tank divisions, which had thundered across Europe in the early years of the war, were now shadows of their former selves. Engines that once roared with menace now sputtered or refused to start altogether. Many tanks were abandoned on roadsides simply because there was no fuel left to keep them moving. Soldiers sometimes resorted to towing artillery pieces with horses, an image that felt painfully out of place in a war defined by industrial power. Commanders who had once planned sweeping offensives now argued over which units would receive the few remaining barrels of gasoline. In civilian life, the blockade's impact was etched into the daily routines of ordinary people. Streets that once bustled with activity now felt strangely hollow. Many shops stood half empty, their shelves lined with ration cards instead of products. Coal shortages grew so severe that families often spent nights wrapped in coats and blankets as temperatures dropped. Long queues formed outside bakeries at dawn, with people hoping to receive their reduced rations before supplies ran out. Mothers skipped meals so their children could eat, while elderly citizens survived on thin soups made from whatever vegetables they could grow in makeshift gardens. Public transportation, once the backbone of city life, barely functioned. Trams and buses broke down frequently, and entire routes were suspended as fuel reserves ran dry. Workers walked miles each day to reach factories that could no longer operate at capacity. The black market flourished, becoming a desperate lifeline for many households. Yet even the black market began to shrink as supplies dwindled, revealing just how deeply the blockade had penetrated the German economy. As conditions worsened, morale began to fracture. Citizens who once cheered Hitler's speeches now listened in silence, unsure whether they believed anything the government said. Rumors spread quickly, stories of shortages, lost territories, and looming defeat. People lowered their voices when talking in public, afraid of being reported to the authorities, but the sense of decline was impossible to hide. Even the regime's most loyal supporters felt a shift. The illusion of invincibility had shattered. German soldiers returning from the front described an even harsher reality. Letters smuggled home, carefully censored but still revealing, spoke of hunger, freezing nights, and battles fought with limited ammunition. Some units operated without proper winter clothing. Others received orders to hold their positions despite lacking the basic supplies needed to survive. Many soldiers believed that reinforcements and equipment were on their way, unaware that the factories back home could no longer produce them. The blockade had turned the promise of relief into a cruel fantasy. Inside government offices, panic unfolded behind closed doors. Economic advisors presented reports that grew worse each month. Reserves of oil and rubber were nearly gone. Steel production had plummeted. Transportation networks were failing. Even essential chemicals used for explosives were running out. High-ranking officials debated unrealistic solutions: secret weapons, last-minute alliances, emergency production drives, but none of these plans addressed the fundamental problem. Germany had been cut off from the world, left to fight a global war with shrinking resources. As the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviets pushed from the east, Germany's shrinking supply chain collapsed completely. Rail lines were bombed repeatedly, making it nearly impossible to move resources across the country. Bridges were destroyed, cutting off vital routes. The few factories that remained functional struggled to transport their goods anywhere. Trains departed half-loaded, broke down mid-route, or simply never arrived. Entire shipments went missing in the chaos, consumed by bureaucratic confusion or captured by advancing enemy forces. In many cities, electricity became unreliable. Power stations lacked coal, and maintenance teams lacked parts. Blackouts occurred randomly, leaving neighborhoods in darkness for hours or days. Hospitals worked under candlelight, rationing medical supplies and performing surgeries with limited equipment. Schools closed intermittently as teachers joined civil defense efforts or struggled to travel. The rhythms of daily life were disrupted beyond recognition. By early 1945, Germany resembled a fortress with crumbling walls. The Berlin government issued desperate calls for citizens to fight, forming local militias and youth brigades. Boys barely in their teens were handed rifles, while old men were pressed into service. But courage alone could not compensate for the lack of ammunition, vehicles, or supplies. Many of these improvised units never made it to the battlefield. Those who did often faced enemy tanks with little more than outdated weapons and fading hope. Meanwhile, Allied commanders observed the effects of the blockade with increasing clarity. Reports from captured soldiers revealed severe shortages of food and fuel. Scouts described abandoned vehicles scattered along roads. Aerial photographs showed empty or dormant industrial zones. The once mighty German war machine was no longer capable of coordinated resistance. its retreat was not just a result of enemy pressure but a direct consequence of internal collapse. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world looked upon the ruins of a nation that had been hollowed out long before its armies laid down their arms. Streets were littered with rubble, factories stood silent, and railway lines were twisted and broken. Civilians emerged from shelters not as citizens of a defeated empire, but as survivors of a country that had been starved of the resources needed to sustain itself. The Allied blockade had played a crucial role in this outcome, not through dramatic battles, but through years of quiet, calculated pressure that left Germany unable to continue the fight. In the end, the blockade proved that wars are not won only by armies. They are won by controlling the flow of resources, by shaping the economic heart of a nation, and by applying steady pressure until even the strongest opponent weakens. Germany's downfall was the result of many forces, but the blockade stood among the most decisive, an invisible wall that slowly tightened until the entire war machine collapsed in slow motion.